Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, July 25th. I'm very, very happy that you are here. And my name is Heather Kraus. I am the founder of an organization called We All Count. And what my organization does is it builds tools and provides trainings to anybody from any sector, any part of the world that wants to get really good at the practice of aligning your data projects with your equity goals and your community goals. And as part of that, we want to make sure that we can have conversations about the good times and the bad times, talk about some example projects, talk about new techniques that are emerging, talk about traditional techniques that we should remember and get good at using. And that's what Talking Data Equity is about. Talking Data Equity is an event that happens most Fridays, not every single Friday, but most Fridays. And I'm going to put the link in the chat here. You can always look up what is going on this week at Talking Data Equity on the Talking Data Equity homepage. And the Zoom link is always the same. So if you have successfully made your way here today, you can successfully make your way here any other day. And the only thing I will promise you is that every single Friday is relevant to data equity, and every single Friday is entirely different. And today we have a guest speaker, or two guest speakers, that I will introduce you to in just a few seconds. But I'm going to answer a couple of logistical questions before I introduce you to our very exciting special guest for today. Logistical question one is, yes, this is recorded. I just put a link in the chat to our data equity community forum. That's a public space. You don't have to pay membership money or anything. And you will find all the recordings from 4 years now of Talking Data Equities in that section. And I'll also make sure that different resources that we talk about or that our speakers reference today are linked there so that you can just relax and enjoy this hour and then know that you can go get all your resources at that link later. I think the only other logistics thing is that because there's a lot of us here today, we're going to ask that while our speakers are sharing their slides, sharing their stories, giving you some examples of their fantastic work, that you keep your microphone turned off during that time. Feel free to use the chat. You can direct message me. You can share ideas and ask questions in the chat. And then at the end of our speakers sharing, we'll have time for live question and answers. And that's when you can turn your microphone on and have a discussion, share responses, and ask questions. All right, so enough from me. I'm very excited that our speakers today are, in my country, in Canada with me today, from a really, really cool organization called Open North. And you'll be hearing more about Open North as we go along, but they're one of the most kind of committed and congruent organizations that I have the privilege to know. They really walk their talk, and that's why I'm so excited to have them here today. We have John Griffin and Christian Medina. John Griffin is the program manager for local government at Open North. And he leads the Community Solutions Network, a program of housing infrastructure in communities Canada, which serves over 80 communities across Canada. And he manages all the local government projects at Open North, specializing in leading complex data governance projects. And boy, are data governance projects getting more complex, as we talked about last week with Nikki and Larry. And he focuses on aligning efforts with client needs and contexts, resolving immediate pain points and challenges, and establishing the foundation for ongoing sustainable improvements in data management and capacity. And normally, when somebody tells me all those fancy consulting words, I'm like, yeah, right. But these folks are actually doing what they say they are doing, which is why we have them as our special guests today. Our second team member from Open North is Christian Medina, and he's the manager for global programs at Open North. His portfolio focuses on data partnerships and collaborations in the nonprofit sector, digital divides, intersectionality in data, and exclusion, and traditionally marginalized populations in technology. With a decade of experience within and outside of government, Christian has managed and delivered projects in complex, challenging, and fast changing context. Recent experiences include public participation and data governance in Ukraine, democracy building in Southeast Asia, open data initiatives across Latin America, and gender based violence data across Canada. So I'm going to turn it over to John and Christian. And you can see they're both busy people and have been very generous in making time for us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Heather. So thank you for that introduction, and we are excited to be here, and definitely on my part, I've been checking out all the old episodes and kind of like glossing all over them and being all like, oh, I like this. I'm like fangirling all over them. So quite excited to be here. And so for this presentation, and John, I don't know if you want to say a few words now, but feel free to jump in.
Uh, just echoing, very excited to be here. I followed a wheel account for a while now, and so really happy to be able to be on the other end of this. So yeah, thanks.
It's like being in like a podcast that we follow for a long time. We're like, oh wow, we get to be the people that other people are listening to. It's exciting. So for today's presentation, we want to give you some of the work we've been doing lately, kind of basing it a little bit on some of the theories we have around data governance and how that applies to the real world, and our experiences working with clients and partners. So it's exciting because we're taking this theoretical concept of data governance, applying it to real world situations, and then getting that feedback on what works and what doesn't. We'll start with the presentation with a little introduction about what Open North does, where we're coming from. We'll talk a little bit about what data governance means to us and in our experiences, linking that to what that means for data equity. Next, we'll share some examples from our projects, both at the local level in Canada and across different sectors. And then we'll end with a little discussion on what this means for advocacy and what this means for um, advocating and promoting more equity in data and data practices. So I'll get started. Uh, so about Open North. So we're a non-for-profit uh, based in Montreal, though we're fully remote, so a lot of folk work from different places. John's actually in BC right now. I'm actually right now in South America, in Colombia, visiting my dad. So, but our base is in Montreal. And short story, we're just a bunch of data nerds. So we spend all our time thinking about data, what the decisions around data is, what does this mean for people that interact with data, with technology, and how can we use data to improve society and to have better processes, more civic-minded organizations, better government processes that are reflective of the needs of individuals. Um, we not just do data management, we also do a little bit of law, of data law. We also do cybersecurity and privacy because all these issues and buzzwords that come around, they're based in data and how we share data, who we share data with, why we share data. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation and for this crowd, we wanted to make sure that we all have a base understanding, or at least all have a similar understanding of what we mean when we say data governance. This is not the only definition, and the word data governance gets thrown out a lot in different contexts. Sometimes we hear it be used as data management. Sometimes we hear it used as a subset of what the open data or opening data is. But for us, we start from the idea that data is not neutral, that it shapes a narrative based on the quality of what is collected and the driving purpose of actors controlling the data. So there's a lot of human decisions around data. It's not innocuous, it's not the new oil, data just doesn't happen. Humans are behind how we're sharing data, how we're using data, what data is relevant, how we collect data. And that's where we start, because a lot of um, how data is shared and used is reflective of power dynamics that humans hold within each other in society. So often data will reflect those power dynamics. There's a lot of examples about how data has been used to harm people that are not always participating in decision making and that do not hold power. Um, so, as Kate Crawford brilliantly says, they are creations of human design. Data and data sets are not necessarily objective. They do have decisions around them, and we need to understand how those decisions are made. Similarly, data is used to tell a story, and so we need to understand how that story is being told and who's telling that story. If we want to use that data properly, we want to challenge the narrative that's being set around data. So, number's not a number, data's not neutral. Next slide, please. And a lot of these decisions are already happening around us all the time, in your everyday lives, in your work, when you log on to Facebook, if you still do that, maybe Instagram, maybe TikTok if you're younger. I'm not sure who's using what these days. I don't use Facebook anymore. But we get to these decisions all the time. Some are purposeful and codified. So, an example from here from Canada is the Montreal Digital Data Charter, which is a set of values and normative guidelines that the city of Montreal uses for when they're sharing, using, reusing, storing data. This was a purposeful process done with civil society actors, with different stakeholders to ask, how should we do data in our city? Other decisions around data are way less formal. So sometimes organizations may seek to collect or not information around an individual. We work a lot with reproductive care and abortion care service providers, and sometimes they very purposefully will choose not to collect data about an individual because it's very dangerous data, right? If you need care and you might be in a situation of violence, that data is extremely sensitive. This is not codified either because you're a small non-for-profit, you're a small organization, you don't have time to create a fancy document to share with everyone. But it is understood within your sector that maybe collecting personal data is not a good idea. Um, Again, some of those are explicit and some of those are purposefully obfuscated. Thinking about the Facebook example, for a long time we didn't really understand what data we were sharing and how that data about ourselves is being used. I think the public has come to a better understanding to that, but there's a lot of sharing in technology that we don't quite understand and that it might be purposefully obfuscated so we don't understand. Um, Next slide, please. Right, so that's the theory. I don't know, John, if you want to jump in. I kind of see you like smiling a little bit, or you're good.
Oh yeah, well, this is my slide, I guess. That's what I
Yes. So
getting
I'm
ready.
going to turn it over to John.
Perfect. Yeah, so as Heather mentioned, I'm actually former program manager of the Community Solutions Network. I need to update that in my bio. The program ended in March, and just really quickly, a little bit of background on that was the program was sort of born out of, for those who are familiar in Canada, the Smart City Initiative funded by the Canadian government. So this was in 2018, and this was very much in the era of, without being too insulting, I guess, but in the era of smart garbage cans, let's say that. So that like very much like innovative solutions for cities was the goal. And so we got a lot of different projects that had come in through that program, some really great ones. But again, the push at this time was, municipalities, local governments across Canada can solve a lot of challenges with new innovative solutions. In some cases, it's absolutely worked, and in other cases, folks started to run up to some of the challenges that present, particularly when you're not at Toronto or Montreal. And so this is where we start to really get into the data challenge, is that if you are a city of 500,000 people or a town of 600 people, the challenges around data largely remain the same. So, for example, your data does not become less private with fewer people. If you only have 600 people, you still need to make the same effort to protect their data that you do if you're a city of 500,000. You still need tools and expertise to turn that data into actionable insights. And then collecting data on residents and infrastructure may be smaller in smaller municipalities. Maybe you don't have quite as much resident data. Maybe you don't have quite as much data on different types of infrastructure. But particularly now, within the space of rapidly changing climate, data around climate, that isn't really impacted quite so much by the amount of residents you have, but maybe by the space you cover geographically where you're located. And so these are some of the challenges that we've seen pop up in our work with municipalities. And while we have worked with municipalities of all sizes, do quite a bit of work with the city of Montreal, we've worked with the city of Toronto. We have also worked with the towns of 600 people, and them recognizing that there are many of these data challenges, seeing the work that is done by larger cities. That's often what is spotlighted when you attend conferences, when you go to talks, and trying to figure out how they're supposed to do that. So that's really where we come in. And so, because if you really think about it, and this was best put by someone working in a small town in one of the webinars we had, said that residents would be really alarmed if they knew the extent of what happened with their data in our town. He said, it's like we have it, some of it's in the cloud, some of it's on a hard drive sitting on someone's desk, some of it's on like Bob's computer that he takes home. Just there tends to be a general assumption that whatever government, no matter how big or small, they handle your data well. Maybe it's not always across the board assumption, but often that is the case. But a lot of municipalities just don't have the capacity or the knowledge to implement a lot of these things that are law. So one of the recent examples that we've highlighted is the town of Bridgewater, which was a smart city winner in 2018. We've worked with them because they ran into very much this challenge around like, how do they manage data with such limited capacity? One piece that they recognized was there was a fairly significant privacy risk. So they brought in a consultant to conduct a privacy impact assessment, which they shared with us. It was a very good PIA. It hit all the right spots, was quite comprehensive. The challenge is it was really good for a city like Toronto to implement. A town of Bridgewater of about 9,000 people, they just sort of like freeze when you see like, here is this laundry list of things that you need to identify and work with. So we were able to work with them to sort of identify, this term gets thrown out a lot, but like low-hanging fruit. What are the things that match their capacity right now, won't take too long to accomplish, and will demonstrate some of the value of meeting these requirements within this PIA. In this instance, we identified a data inventory, because one of the things that came up quite a bit was like, we know we have a lot of data, we don't know where it all is, and I don't know what it all is. So simply the process of going through with staff and figuring out, okay, what data sets do you interact with most regularly? What do you create? What do you manage? What do you use? And with that, putting together a more comprehensive data inventory that highlighted some of those, different challenges they had, where data was stored, and was really eye-opening for a lot of staff there to get that sense of like, this is why data is important, which is not always a given when you don't have any staff whose job is specifically data. Here you're talking about different departments and folks like the classic, like data is side of the desk work. So really the takeaway from that work is recognizing that while there are a lot of really great tools out there, a lot of, really fancy technology that is available, and again, you see spotlighted by a lot of larger municipalities, often with smaller towns, rural communities, looking at like starting from basics is a really great place. And just by virtue of someone saying, well, we use Excel, it's like, great. A lot of people come in and say, we use Excel as if like that's the worst thing ever. Like, nope, not. That's fine. You understand you're collecting, you're using your data. Doesn't mean like you don't need to be using a new like data imaging software. Like that's totally fine. So the other piece that I alluded to earlier with my talk about climate is that we have done a fair bit of work around the climate space. You kind of can't avoid it, obviously. I suspect everyone here impacted fairly regularly, particularly, I don't know wherever others are located, but in Canada, just heat wave after heat wave right now. Currently in BC, which amazingly doesn't have any forest fires raging at the moment. So within this context, data around climate is one of those things that isn't quite so readily available, particularly for rural communities. And when you live in a rural community, these are some of the residents that are most at risk of climate disasters, right? Whether they're forest fires, whether they're flooding, whether they get hit with a heat dome. And municipalities in these areas struggle to understand how to adapt to these changes. Where should they focus their very limited resources? And how do they pull the data to like inform that decision making? So in our work, we've talked to a lot of municipalities that maybe you find a small municipality of 2,000 people and they have a climate plan. You're like, oh, this looks like a great climate plan. And then you talk to them about how that was developed. And unsurprisingly, most of the time it is a consultant that comes in, and that's not a bad thing. You know, that's fine. But then you say, okay, well, there's a lot of data in here. Yep, the consultant collected and put that data together. Great. Where is that? It's like, we don't own that data. The consultant owns that data. And so at that point, you probably ask yourself, all right, well, this plan has goals attached to that data. How are these municipalities, how are these communities going to mark progress towards these goals? If they don't, they're not able to routinely check and look at that data. And the answer is vibes. Like, be perfectly honest, they'll say, we'll do another plan in 5 years. We'll collect data again at that point. It might be the same consultant, it might be a different one. We'll hope for the best. And so, whereas larger municipalities in Canada do have the staffing and resources to collect a lot of that climate data, there is a real lack of it within smaller communities. And some of that is picked up within the nonprofit space or by academia or by larger levels of government at the province or federal level. But for unique decision making in these small communities, there is a real need for like understanding. And again, this goes beyond just understanding which areas are most likely to be hit by or at risk of like extreme heat, but also what residents have AC units, who has access to cooling centers. And so there is a real equity issue when you go and you interact with staff in these like small communities about how they're supposed to protect their residents from like rapid climate change. So yeah, like when we talk about data, again, it's very much for within this local government setting for municipalities and communities of all sizes. But over the last several years, we found a real need within these smaller communities and something we're really trying to work to address. We're limited in, often a big part of the answer is funding. But where we can, it's about building a little bit of capacity for somebody who, it's never going to be their full-time job, but has at least an understanding of like what privacy looks like, or at least an understanding of like, hey, this is where you can access some of that data for free. So to wrap up my little piece here, it's really just to remember that within the context of like smaller municipalities, that while a lot of the talk, and realize I'm sort of maybe preaching to the choir a little bit within this setting, a lot of the talk these days is about the different, for example, AI tools that will direct residents to the best resources or identify climate risks. And absolutely, those things exist and there is value to them. Recommending them to municipalities and communities across Canada as a solution when there isn't the capacity to simply know which residents like have AC or which residents have access to cooling centers, there is limited value. So with that, I will turn it over to Christian.
Thanks, John.
Next slide.
Yeah, and I'll mention I have my puppy here. Her name is Cora. She is a keen follower of data justice as well and data equity. but it's raining where I am, so she gets scared, so I need to hold her. Um, but she also has a lot of good things to say about data because we talk about it all the time in my house. So I'm sure she must have picked up something. So back to the presentation. On my end, I wanted to share some of the work we've been doing very practically across Canada on reproductive justice data and gender-based violence data. So this is data specific to access to services, shelters, care for people that are in a situation of gender-based violence, women, trans folk, and other folk. Um, that might need the services. So we work with a lot of frontline facing organizations to make sure that they're using the data that they have in an appropriate way that's reflective of the needs and of the values in the sector. And this means working with them to think about data governance, think about the decisions that are being made, some of them made by them, but also some of them being imposed by government and funders. Um, because if you have a big grant, then maybe you have to report certain things, but some of those things that you're asked to report might not be appropriate to protect the lives of and the safety of women, trans folk, and other folk that access these services. On the other hand, folk recognize that it's important to know what's happening in the gender-based violence space, and it's important to have data about it so we can have better actions and we can have more targeted funding that is reflective in real time of the needs of these populations at risk. And then so it's an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, we recognize that this data is extremely sensitive. But on the other hand, we recognize that it's extremely important to be able to share this data so that we can address what folk in Canada right now are calling an epidemic of gender-based violence. Um, so that's the problematic we face. Other issues are data availability. So because of the nature of gender-based violence and of folks seeking abortion care and other forms of reproductive care, data availability is low. Or it's of poor quality. So the data that's available, it's mostly survey data, which is not, it's small in size, um, and it's often kept by authorities that folk don't trust. So in Canada, a lot of data about gender-based violence is held by the police services here called the Royal Mounted Police, the Mounties. If you're outside from Canada, you've seen them with the hats and they wear like a red suit. However, there is a history of violence and conflict between them and marginalized populations, indigenous populations who are largely overrepresented in gender-based violence data sets. So there's a lot of distrust, which means that the data that's available is poor quality, right? People will go to report to the police if something bad has happened. And then, as in many other sectors that are seeking equality for underrepresented and marginalized groups, it's a stretched sector. Executive directors are under a lot of pressure. Most of them are non-for-profits. You have to do a million things with like shoestring budget, and if you have to find a bed for the night for someone every day, the last thing you think about if you work in a shelter is data, right? You don't care too much about data and, fair game. People's safety comes first. Like, we all like data, but, keeping people safe, keeping people from sleeping rough is more priority. So that's kind of the problematic in the work we do. How do we solve this? And then so similar to what John's mentioning, there's already really interesting practices that are happening in the sector that people don't view as data governance, that people don't view as practices around data. So I hinted at this before. In the sector, people purposefully don't collect private information because they know that they don't have the capacity or the means to keep it safe and keep it private necessarily. So it's very much a data decision to not collect personal private information when you don't have to. Um, and this is interesting because it creates a tension with funders and with donors that they want to know how many indigenous people attended a shelter, how many people of color are accessing reproductive care services. And then when we have these conversations with these groups and tell them, like, that's a data decision that you can fight. Your decision is based on protecting individuals. Their decision is based on funding or on research. It makes it very explicit which one should take priority over the other one, right? And the sector is very adept at this. And for example, they don't share data with the RCMP, with the police and the Royal Mounted Police, because they know it's going to be very hard to access. They choose to share data amongst themselves, but not with governments or with other source of authorities, because they know it would be a disservice to people that are already mistrustful of authorities to do that. Um, so that's very practical. Um, the work we do is trying to guide them through these conversations in their own words and highlight their own skills already at it. We do some more capacity building work as well, capabilities building, so that they're able to have these conversations with donors, so that they're able to mention relevant privacy legislation when they don't feel comfortable sharing, when they're able to address a funder or address a donor and say, the reason we're not reporting on how many Indigenous people attended my service is because they would be really easy to re-identify. Even if I don't collect their name, if I'm Indigenous from a community of 500 people and maybe I have another intersectionality, maybe I'm gay, there's not that many people that are Indigenous, gay, and live in a community of 500 people and that are in an age where I would need an abortion. So, being able to explicitly point to that and have a framework of how I use data gives power back to this frontline serving organizations, to navigate these conversations. Whereas before it might have just been imposed. It might have been like, you have to give me this data or else there's no money. It's in the contract. Yes, and it is similar issues. I agree with Megan. We've seen that in other communities of like serving Latinos, serving Black folk. So definitely not limited to the gender-based violence sector in Canada. Next slide, please. So I think we want to kind of like wrap up the conversation with these examples with like 2 points. So to reiterate, like data is not inert, right? Human decisions um, are taken, and often these decisions seek to potentialize the value of data, to use the data for something. Who's taking these decisions and why these decisions are taking is what we want to highlight. In our view, we can use data to advocate for better services for people that are usually not included in decision making, for folk that usually are underserved by authorities. Um, Again, because data in itself is neutral, we're able to help them potentialize its value. Like data doesn't necessarily need to flow to the folk that have power. Um, and then so folk often use this data to improve their situation. The second point, and the one that I'm most excited about, and the one that I'm most nerdy about, is that we can also advocate for better data practices so that this data can flow to the people that really need it. So we don't just need to say, oh, this data is going to show that this population is underserved, but we can also talk about how the way we collect, the way we use this data, the way this data is being shared is adding an additional barrier to folk, so that they can realize that. So being able to turn these data governance frameworks, these conversations around how data is being used, where there's lack of capacities, why rural folk in rural communities can't access this data, in itself is an advocacy strategy for better equity, for better data justice. Um, and that's kind of what we keep going at with these data governance frameworks, adding the tools so that people know how to have this conversation and don't let just data be imposed on them or data practices just be imposed. Next slide, please. Right. So I think that's that's the talk. That's where we're coming from. Just feel free if you have any other questions after this to contact us. And yeah, thanks again for listening to us. I mean, we're both very passionate about this, so we're excited to talk more about it.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much, John. It is really, really cool work that you do. I love the way that you approach data equity through a data governance perspective. And this, I learned a lot. I've already had a chance to talk to you and know about Open North, and I learned a lot today. So I really, really appreciate it. And so there are a few questions in the chat, but before we get to those, I want to remind you that this is your opportunity, if you're live with us today, to turn on your microphone and ask a question. Probably the easiest way to do that is raise your hand. If you click on the little react button, which is usually at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little word that says raise hand. And if you do that, we will turn your microphone on. If you can't figure that out, or Zoom has just updated itself and it's not where it's supposed to be, you can either just put it in the chat or just turn your microphone on. We're a small enough community that that works too. So if you want to share a response or ask a question, this is your chance to do that live. And while,
I'll
go ahead.
just,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'll just go stop sharing screen as well. The full vision.
Awesome.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, John. While we wait for anybody in the room to ask a question or share a response, I'm gonna elevate one of the questions that's coming to me in the chat, which is back to that. A lot of people were unfamiliar with the data governance kind of format that you mentioned in Montreal. And there's a request about, can you summarize that in a sentence or two about Montreal's approach? And part two is there an accountability mechanism in that?
Yep, I can speak to that.
Great.
So definitely because we help create the charter. So there's two elements. There's the public participation one. So it was built with folk in Montreal, determining what matters to them. And then it's a very interesting example of a human rights approach to data charters. So it's very much based on a rights of respecting the rights of residents, right? Not citizens, residents, which is an important distinction, of residents in Montreal. And then staff are meant to follow this charter in decisions that they make about it. So folk can raise an issue of if they feel that anything that the city is using is in violation of this charter. Um, Whether there's a legal mechanism to challenge if this happens, not to my understanding, but it is a very public commitment. So transgressing this really is political suicide, in my opinion.
That's great. Thank you so much for the explanation. I really appreciate that. And we'll put links to this kind of information into the same place where we are putting the recording. David, you have your hand up. Go ahead. Happy to see you. How are you?
Good. Thanks for the presentation today. I definitely learned a lot, like Heather said. And I did have a question about a resource as it relates to data governance in terms of examples of policies, procedures, or standards, if you had a resource for us.
Yeah, so I'll caveat this, which is always fun, with that. So much of our work around data governance ends up being very dependent, and I'll sort of use this to also answer, I think, Haley's question as well, which is that like we go in trying not to make any assumptions with the folks that we're working with. That being said, like our general approach to data governance and management rests on like a understanding. I don't know if folks are familiar with the DAMA data Management Association. I'll drop the link in here. So that's like the base for our knowledge and expertise going into a lot of this. But typically what we will do is have sort of a relatively broad like discovery phase with whatever the organization is. And this looks like an assessment to both understand like, okay, what are the challenges that exist, but also what are the priorities? So in some cases, the priority is we need to follow the law because we currently are not. Great. And so really then that's just focusing on, okay, we're going to move forward with this priority because this is the thing that people maybe not get excited about, but have decided, this is the important piece. And then really from there, it's working directly with staff to create whatever those steps are. So the Bridgewater example I used, maybe that's more helpful, is they already had a data governance committee in place. So that's often a thing that we do recommend, right? Is there needs to be a decision-making body that will be responsible for decisions around data governance before you can really move forward and start making decisions around data governance. So working with them, like that was where we decided, okay, a data inventory makes the most sense, and then worked hand in hand with staff to develop that data inventory. Again, in specific policies, often a lot of, at least I can speak to the municipality example, a lot of municipalities will have policies in place. Sometimes they're a little outdated, but privacy policies often cover a significant portion of that. So it's often just getting folks in line with what exists, because, for example, you might have a policy within an organization that most people we work with in municipalities use Microsoft. They may operate in SharePoint is the goal of the organization. And then when you talk to everybody, the reality is it's, things exist on people's OneDrives or somewhere separate because just they never receive training or SharePoint doesn't meet their needs. So it's that classic challenge of moving forward as an organization with a tool or approach that does not agree with everybody and then just ends up making your data governance practices substantially worse.
Mm.
I
don't know how well that answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I will drop in the chat because a lot of the work we've done it's specific to Montreal, but out of that work we created different resources for folk to be able to go on their own data governance journeys. As John mentioned, kind of not making that assumption that this is a cookie cutter approach, but actually folk being able to figure out what their own needs are, where their capacities are at. So I've dropped that as well in the chat. Again, with the caveat that this is developed in a city context, because funding is something we all live and rule by. But take it with a grain of salt. But it's helpful if you are thinking about how do I do data governance in my context or with my partners. All these resources are freely accessible.
And
Great.
to add to that, I will drop in a link. We have a bunch of freely available courses on our website as well that cover different aspects of data governance practices. So open data policy, fundamentals of data partnership, that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you.
No worries.
Those are fabulous resources. I highly recommend you check them out. And they're getting a lot of love in the chat, which is great. Like I said, the Open North team is amazing. You cannot go wrong hanging in with the Open North people. Okay. Another question that was just direct message to me, so you won't see it in the chat, is about what you were just talking about. I think it was you, Christian, I'm not sure, about how kind of funding rules these data governance decisions. And when we're talking about stuff like collecting gender-based violence data, especially in small communities, and then that's very much true in the States as well as in Canada, as well as in South America. Actually, we're working with a team in Colombia right now. And whether we're collecting that gender-based violence data or whether we're collecting data, somebody was mentioning along an international border where there might be a lot of political stuff. The Texas-Mexico border was mentioned in this case. There can be competing interests, right? It's obvious to the service provider why we would not collect data. And it's also obvious to maybe the government why they do want that data. Can you speak at all to a practical approach to even managing that conversation where the powerful person with the money doesn't always win?
Yeah, and like the power dynamic is real, right? Like if you have to feed your staff, if you have to feed yourself out of this money, that's when the push comes to shove, right? And then so it is full recognition. It's extremely tricky to have this conversation with your funders. However, that being said, in our experience, a lot of these organizations are very conscientious of who they take money from. Right? In I can speak to this field more specifically. I suspect in other fields is the same. But if you are funding women's shelters, your kind of donor is a little bit more open to having a conversation with what works best for you, being frontline. And often we find the starting point is this one. And even for ourselves, like we wouldn't pretend to be experts in this sector. We just support them. So we just fully want to recognize that this is them leading this kind of conversations and them coming up with this kind of strategies, the folk at the front lines, which is like.
Did we just lose
Did
Christian
we
entirely?
lose Christian? Maybe the rain has started.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be back momentarily.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
apologize. I can't answer his
of
what
course.
he's speaking to, but
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think that he will be back soon. It didn't look alarming. It looked more like rain. All
he
right.
was connected directly to the internet. He had the Ethernet cable and everything running in for this. So
Yeah, no, life's like that. Yeah, so I think from my experience, I'm not speaking for Christian or Open North at all, but from my experience, because we also kind of work in this sector, it is that in terms of having the conversations with the funders and with the people whose data you're collecting, the number one thing that has to be inevitable and a commitment to equity is full transparency. Because as Christian was saying, if you are taking that money and you're using that money to feed your staff, there are probably certain contractual obligations that you have agreed to. Here's Christian. And it probably is a compromise between the preferences of the people that you're serving and the preferences of the funder. But what is non-negotiable is absolute transparency for every piece of data that you're collecting, what exactly is happening to that data. And I really want to emphasize that that includes aggregation. Sometimes people think we're not going to share your data. Your data is going to be completely private. And then I see them make tables and send these tables to the funder and to the public health department. And they're like, well, that wasn't their data. That was aggregated data. And that I understand that idea, but especially now, and John, I know you were talking about AI tools. It takes an AI tool no time at all to disaggregate and identify people from an aggregation table. It is shockingly easy. Christian, we're so happy you're good. How's Cora?
She's good. She's crying at the door right now, but that's okay.
Oh
I was sorry about that.
no.
My internet escaped from me for a bit.
Of course, we're happy you're well.
Yes, yeah, especially coming from Colombia, it's like, oh, what happened down there? I guess should I pick up where where I left
That'd be
off?
great. If you want to finish that thought, that'd be perfect.
Sure. And so yeah, so what I was mentioning was that because the partnerships are relatively well and they have a good relationship with the funders, it's just something that funders don't think about necessarily. They don't think about how this data can be harmful because they themselves haven't gone through the exercise of thinking about decisions around data. So having this established data governance framework, this set of values where it's like, here's a list of things we won't do because of this, it makes the conversation, it drives it forward, and it actually encourages folk to start thinking about, okay, like how am I doing this with my other donors or with my other partners? Am I navigating this relationship properly where like I recognize there's a power dynamic where I give you money and you provide a service for me? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I really like how you mentioned sometimes funders haven't really considered the implication of what they're asking. And I've found that to be true for all of the decades that I've been working with funders and managing these, competing priorities. And one of the things that we really like to do is ask the funders staff to take whatever survey they're hoping that their quote unquote clients will take. And that often immediately opens their eyes to the fact that, their staff does not want to complete this survey. Why would their clients want to complete this survey? Any other questions? We have about 60 more seconds. And while you think, if you have any other questions, will remind you that we are back next week. Next week, we have Helen Cara, who will be coming to us from, I believe, from England. That's certainly where they work. I think that's where they are now. And she does something called radical research. And so that will be a fantastic conversation. Again, same time, same Zoom link. And we're going to try something new here, which we have never tried before. So bear with me. We're going to take a tiny poll, a 1-question poll, because talking data equity exists so that you will learn something new, get a new idea, be able to cross-pollinate what's working and not working in your sector with what's working and not working in other sectors. But we have no idea of which talking data equities you like the most, or which ones are most useful to you. So we're going to start asking you a 1-question poll, which is, how much did you like this? This poll does not collect any data about you. It does not collect your name. It does not collect your IP address. It does not collect your email address. It only collects one thing, which is a star or a number. Actually, I thought it was going to be 5 stars, but it's a number. So totally optional. It's going to influence a little bit who's coming up in future talking data equities. If you want to tell us how useful this was. And David, I'm super happy to hear that you are already implementing what you have learned today. I feel the same way. I 10 out of 10. This was both inspiring and useful, which is what we're going for in talking data equity, because we absolutely know that the waters are a little bit rough out there, whatever country you're coming from. And we really, really want you to know that you are not alone in this, and that every choice we make matters. And so if you feel like there's nothing you can do, come hang out with us at Talking Data Equity, because you'll definitely find one thing that you can do. And huge thank you to Christian and John, both for being a part of and the amazing organization that Open North is, as well as taking time out of your busy schedules and when your dog needed you to hang out with us and help us really understand a very, very important practice about data governance. I really appreciate it.
Well, Heather, thank you so much for having us, and everyone else, thank you so much for spending lunch or whatever time it is, wherever you are, with us today. This has been an absolute pleasure and a real honor. So
yeah, great. Okay, take really good care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye, everybody.